Despite Demon's Souls being the very first Souls title, it was not the one I started out with, and I imagine that's true of most Souls fans. As the Dark Souls series blew up and garnered ever more critical, commercial and cultural acclaim, it wasn't at all uncommon to see the occasional exasperated Souls veteran in comment sections and forums telling people, no, Dark Souls wasn't the first Souls game, all the stuff you like about it was already done by Demon's Souls. Well, there was a modest chunk of the fanbase who played and enjoyed Demon's Souls upon its release in 2009, as well as a further chunk who would go and check out the series' roots after enjoying a later Soulsborne game. There seemed to be a greater percentage of the fanbase who never seemed all that interested in Demon's Souls, though a big reason for this was its status as a PS3 exclusive, which wasn't even available on the PS4. Of course, the remake in 2020 made it somewhat more accessible and with a very shiny new coat of paint too, though again its accessibility was limited to just the PS5, with a PC release likely not on the table anytime soon, if ever. Me myself personally, my first experience of Demon's Souls was circa 2013, after playing my fair share of Dark Souls 1 on the Xbox 360, and in a fit of indulgent extravagance I made the decision to pick up a second-hand PS3, mainly to try Demon's Souls and see what it had to offer. For some reason, I'd always considered it to be an older game compared to the more modern Dark Souls, but if you were from Europe, there was actually only a gap of 16 months between the two games, and upon starting it up, I remember being really surprised that the graphics were actually pretty damn decent. It makes me wonder if there are a lot of Elden Ring fans who now regard Dark Souls the same way a lot of Dark Souls fans used to regard Demon's Souls, perhaps dismissing it as a game for the elderly. Being the true Souls Progenitor, Demon's Souls was the first game to implement now signature features and mechanics still used by FromSoft today, like bloodstains, a hub area populated by a Maiden and assorted NPCs, sorcery and miracles, the ability to transmogrify boss souls into weapons or spells, intricate level design with branching paths and shortcuts, and many other motifs and designs which would continue to pop up in FromSoft's games for many years to come, such as the Vanguard enemy, who the Asylum Demon, Stray Demon and Erdtree avatar would be based off of, the bridge guarded by dragons which would appear again near the Undead Parish and again in Upper Lothric Castle, and even the idea of an NPC you can save who goes on to slaughter other NPCs like Lothric and the Suspicious Beggar. But for all the strength and staying power of the ideas and mechanics found in Demon's Souls, I've never found it to be the most mechanically refined entry in the series, sometimes placing more of an emphasis on aesthetics and atmosphere over enjoyability, and featuring certain bosses which made for pretty rough experiences even back in 2009. I played through the original Demon's Souls on the PS3 3 times back in the day, and a further 3 times on the PS5 in more recent years, and indeed it will be the footage from the remake I'll be using throughout this video, because I just don't have a PS3 anymore, and let's be honest, the remake is pretty damn stunning. Perhaps not quite equally as atmospheric as the original in some places, but stunning nonetheless. Before I actually get started with the retrospective though, I will say this. I've never loved Demon's Souls, but that doesn't mean I dislike it. In fact, I think it's a really great game, and I always have a lot of fun anytime I play through it, but I've just never quite been taken or touched by it, the way that the later Soulsborne games touched me. And that's one of the reasons why it's been the very last Soulsborne game I've opted to do a retrospective on. Let me reiterate though, that despite the odd critique I have here and there, I do think it's a really great game, and its status as the Souls Progenitor cannot be disregarded, though ultimately, the single most important aspect of any game for me is always, how much do I enjoy it, not how important was it. As for what to expect from the structure of this video, I'll first provide a bit of an introduction to the game's world and story, then from there I'll cover its levels and bosses, starting from the first Archstone all the way to the 5th and final one. I'll also provide some explanation, analysis and critique on the game's various mechanics along the way, and even occasionally chuck in a wee bit of lore. As I say in all my videos though, I am in no way a lore expert of this game or any Soulsborne game, and so don't expect anything too in-depth from me in that regard. It's just not really my thing, and there are countless other great channels which do deep dives into that sort of thing. Also, with this being the first Souls game, I'll be making quite frequent comparisons and callbacks to stuff from the later games. Lastly, if you find yourself enjoying the video, why not drop a wee like, and maybe even subscribe if you really like it. Many thanks. But enough with all this elephant talk, I think it's high time I actually got on with the bloody video. So folks, let's talk Demon's Souls. Exactly as would go on to be the case with every subsequent Soulsborne game, Demon's Souls begins in a time of great existential crisis for the world, and this is all thanks to an ancient, unfathomable being known as the Old One. As the opening words tell us, on the first day man was given a soul, and with it clarity. As to who it was exactly who gave men souls, that is not specified, though presumably it's some sort of god. And indeed, the form of writing here isn't dissimilar to the start of the book of Genesis. On the first day, man was given a soul, and with it clarity. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. However, on the second day, upon earth was planted an irrevocable poison, a soul-devouring demon, and the demon in question is the Old One. As a result of man's use, or perhaps misuse, of a power known as the Soul Arts, the Old One was awakened, bringing with it legions of demons who would rampage across the world, devouring men's souls wherever they roamed, and enveloping entire regions of the land in a thick, colourless fog. After half of humankind was annihilated by the demons, beings from the time known as the Monumentals managed to lull the Old One back to slumber with a combined knowledge of the Soul Arts, and thus the demons were defeated, though the world itself was left in a broken, disconnected state, and knowledge of the Soul Arts was lost. After an indeterminate period of time, humanity knew relative peace, at least from the demons. However, despite the literal pandemonium of the past, humanity once again began to dabble in the Soul Arts to grow and thrive. Inevitably, the Old One was roused from its slumber to once again wreak demonic havoc upon the world, beginning with the northern kingdom of Boletaria, led by King Allant XII. As such, Boletaria is surrounded by that same thick, colourless fog, and save one individual, Valorfax, every other sage, saint or warrior who has entered through the fog would not emerge back out from it, and that's where our player character comes in, braving their way through the fog to see for themselves what has become of Boletaria, and perhaps to save it and be forever hailed as a great hero. After fighting through Boletaria's outpost passage against soul-starved dreglings and fierce blue-eyed knights, we encounter our first demon, and it goes really well. However, death is not the end for us, because rather than oblivion, we end up in a strange realm of reality existing between life and death, known as the Nexus, with the word Nexus literally translating to a means of connection, a tie, a link. From the Nexus, 5 regions of the world can be accessed via their respective archstones, and within these regions roam various powerful demons which exist purely to devour human souls. Souls which then flow up to the extraordinarily powerful archdemons before being devoured by the bottomless pit of nothingness that is the Old One, made ever more powerful with each new soul devoured, progressively covering more and more of the world in that colourless fog until some brave hero defeats the demons and once again lulls the Old One back to slumber, at least until the cycle repeats itself once again at some inevitable point in the future. And thus, although our character came to these cursed lands willingly, they are now a prisoner of the Nexus, hence the Nexial binding locked onto their person, and thus we cannot die, with the only perceivable path to freedom being to defeat demons and claim their demon souls, gaining a power beyond human imagination. And that's the setup for Demon's Souls and our motivation to go out and fight stuff. It's a really solid setup, and I think at its core it's somewhat less complex than the plots, worlds and motivations we saw in later FromSoft games. Though in saying that, I still had no clue what the story meant at all until I did a deal more watching and reading afterwards, as is usually the case with me with these games. To be honest, for as much as I adore the lore of FromSoft games, the means of storytelling isn't really for me. Whether it's a film, a show or a game, I don't really want to have to do research to understand what it all means or what even happened throughout the game, whereas you do need to do that in these games. For me, the only reason it consistently works in FromSoft stuff is because of how compelling the lore itself usually is, making it so even if you don't understand an event, character or location, then you'll either do the research in-game as some people enjoy, or as I'd imagine most people do, you look up theories and such online to learn and enjoy the scholarly work of other lore divers. As much as this method of storytelling does work for FromSoft though, I do dislike the influence it had on some other games, because a lot of your more indie developers seem to look at FromSoft stuff and think that all they had to do to make a compelling game world was to make everything miserable and cryptic and deliver all your lore through item descriptions, and I'm afraid that's just not enough, at all. But I'm rambling a bit, so let's get back to Demon Souls. Speaking of item descriptions, there's really not anywhere near as great a focus on them here when compared to later games. And so your story information will primarily come from the cutscenes at the beginning and the end, the dialogue from characters found both within and without the Nexus, and through careful observation of the environment. Even the actual Demon Souls you collect after each boss encounter contain no information whatsoever on the boss you just fought, and that's a real shame. Here's an example of a boss soul from Dark Souls 3. Like, wow, look at all that lore, wow! Now look at a typical Demon Soul from Demon Souls. There's nothing here. By the way, let me apologise in advance for the frequency with which the words demon and souls will come up in this video. It's just unavoidable. At the very beginning, we do of course create our character, and for this playthrough I went for a barbarian starting class with a big focus on strength, vitality and endurance, though I also played through a large chunk of the game on a separate playthrough afterwards with a magician build, and so I'll be showing footage from both playthroughs throughout this video. I did this because the Demon Souls experience can feel pretty freaking different when you compare a pure melee playstyle to something more magic focused, because although the selection of spells on offer here is quite basic compared to the varieties we'd later see in things like Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, magic is very powerful in this game, particularly for some enemies. And so let's cover the first level. At the start of the game you can't level up, much like in Bloodborne and Elden Ring, now that I think about it. And furthermore, although there are 5 archstones within the Nexus, each leading to different parts of the world, as well as a 6th archstone which is destroyed and not really referenced in-game apart from in the opening cutscene, only the first of these archstones can initially be used, transporting the player to the kingdom of Boletaria. Now of course, perhaps the area where Demon Souls differs from every other Soulsborne game the most is in world design, because rather than having an open interconnected world where most areas can be accessed via one route or another from most other areas, we instead have worlds and levels. Now they aren't literally different in-game worlds, but rather are all situated at different regions throughout the one in-game world, but it helps to think of them as different worlds from a thematic perspective, and indeed the 5 worlds are all very different in style, atmosphere and even difficulty. Furthermore, with the exception of the fat officials which appear in both Boletaria and Stonefang Tunnel, the enemies found in each world are unique there, giving them all even more of a unique identity. For future reference throughout the video, the convention when discussing Demon Souls levels is to say 1-2 for the second level of World 1, or 4-1 for the first level of World 4. However, although the entire game world isn't connected, the levels within each world are. So for example, you can make your way from the very start of Stonefang Tunnel to the very end without a single load screen, unless you die, which would never happen anyway. We are introduced to the very first Souls Dragon within 10 seconds of entering Boletaria, holding a mouthful of corpses no less, and while it does look rather conventional as far as dragons go, it technically is a demon, hence why you inherit a demon soul if you manage to kill it later on. Just as your most basic enemy in Dark Souls 1 is hollows, their equivalent here are dreglings, emaciated slave soldiers wearing tattered clothing with makeshift armour and weaponry, though there are many more formidable soldiers found further ahead in the level, and especially towards the end of Boletaria in 1.3 and 1.4. Something which struck me immediately upon entering into combat with the dreglings is that their movesets are extremely predictable. They approach you, and then to close the last bit of distance they'll always do the same jump attack, and if you remain too close after the jump attack, they'll always follow it up with this 5-hit flurry, whereas if you move out of range after the jump attack, they'll cancel the flurry. You'll fight a ton of dreglings in 1.1, and so you'll be seeing this move a lot. This is an early example of how much less complex enemy movesets are here, and that goes for the bosses too. This isn't Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring where enemy movesets are complex and varied. Instead, many enemies have just a handful of attacks, some of which they will spam repeatedly. I don't necessarily say this as a critique of Demon Souls though, because greater complexity doesn't always equate to a greater gaming experience, and I actually kinda liked how I knew nearly exactly how some of the game's basic enemies would behave in given combat situations, because I'd know exactly how to counter it. That said, I still ended up getting hit quite a lot by these guys, once again demonstrating that I'm not really very good at games. Very near the beginning, there's a staircase leading to a gate which clearly leads to a different section of the level, yet curiously, there's not even an option to try and open it, indicating that a key is not the answer here. As any Demon Souls veteran watching already knows, of course, access to this area, as well as several other areas throughout the game, is governed by the World Tendency mechanic. And oh, what a mechanic. I'll save the World Tendency discussion for further on in this video though. I am of course playing the remake here, which totally recreated the game world to make it up to modern standards. Though honestly, I think the PS3 version still holds up visually, and it certainly had its own particular atmosphere that was somewhat cleaned up and sterilised to some degree in the remake, starting with the overly modernised look of the UI. That's not to say that the remake lacks atmosphere though, because I actually think it was somewhat enhanced in some areas, especially the Valley of Defilement, which looks more disgusting than ever. One area which didn't seem to receive even a hint of a cleanup though was enemy AI, and that's a real fucking shame, because it needed cleaning up, as hilariously demonstrated by this enemy, which just walks directly into the death pit instead of going around the death pit. I'll touch on other examples of outdated AI as they come up throughout the video, but it's probably my single biggest gripe with Demon Souls, mainly rearing its ugly head in some of the game's bosses. Although the bulk of enemies in 1.1 are dreglings and lesser knights armed with crossbows, spears and firebombs, we are introduced to the original badass knight design when we see the blue-eyed knight, and this is a tradition I adore in FromSoft games, having an imposing knight enemy with a distinctive appearance who hits harder than everyone else and who is actually intimidating, something they'd go on to do with the Black Knights in Dark Souls, I guess the Hide Knights in Dark Souls 2 and the Lothric Knights in Dark Souls 3. The Blue-Eyed Knights probably aren't quite as challenging as these future iterations, though very nearby there happens to be a Red-Eyed Knight, a late game enemy placed in the very first level to destroy any innocent new player who just wants to see what's around the corner here, and then they die to it, and then die again before reaching their bloodstain, losing all their souls. This didn't happen to me though, it happened to a friend. There's actually not a good reason to even kill this dude right now anyway, to be honest, other than bragging rights. You can finally brag to your family and friends at work about how you beat the Red-Eyed Knight on 1-1 without levelling up, finally. You can come back here at the end of the game though to unlock and enter the mausoleum it's guarding. We come across our first character out in the world in 1.1.2. There are a bunch of folk to interact with back at the Nexus of course, some of whom provide important functions, but you'll also find various NPCs throughout the world to be interacted with and in many cases rescued. Speaking of rescuing, Ostrava here, clad in his golden armour, needs some rescuing, being besieged by soul-hungry dreglings eager for a taste of his big delicious cock. This part's perfect for chucking a few firebombs, hence the concentration of weaker enemies, the presence of explosive barrels, as well as the frequency which firebombs drop from enemies in this level, and this will come in particularly handy for the boss of course. After saving this,
pampered little lordling,
he'll give us a telescope and wander off. The issue here is that if you just let him wander off and forget about him, he can actually die to the many knights in the next area, so you've got to follow him about for a bit to make sure he doesn't get too badly fucked up. Even once you do all this though, he doesn't actually go anywhere, he will literally just aimlessly wander around throughout this section of the level. The red dragon we see at the start of the level ain't just for show, and indeed both it as well as its blue counterpart are perched threateningly atop this rocky outcrop, and the sight of these two monsters as well as the treasure-laden corpses before them is fucking awesome. You're totally out of range of them from back here, but the sight of all those shiny droppings makes you wonder if you should risk going for them or just play it safe, because this is pretty far on in the level after all, and you're close to unlocking the way to the level boss from here. I'm sad to say that I pushed out here with my tail between my legs, though after later taking down the red dragon, I came back and picked up all the treasure, and strangely, the blue dragon doesn't seem to notice you at all here, and nor can you kill it here. Even my arrows went right through it, robbing me of an easy kill. The death of the red dragon would not come till later though, and so I'd still have to contend with it at the bridge just further on, and I remember seeing this part for the first time a decade ago. Jesus, I'm old. I'm pointing at the screen in excitement, because it's the same thing they did at the Undead Parish, and the dragon. It's really cool to see the origins of some of your favourite sections from Souls, and this will happen repeatedly throughout the game, including at the boss of the same level. Phalanx is an amorphous, blackened amalgamation protecting a glowing green core, and protected even further by a, well, phalanx of these spear-wielding hoplite enemies, and of course we'd see nearly an identical sort of enemy idea in the painted world of Ariamis from Dark Souls 1, again armed with spear and shield, albeit with a somewhat more grotesque design. This is where all those firebombs throughout the level come in extremely handy, particularly if you selected the Providential Ring as your starting gift to raise your item discovery to get even more of them, because they make really short work of this boss. If you try and just charge into the thing, it can be hard to actually do any decent damage because of the number of these shielded enemies and the fact that many of them are attacking you at once with both melee and ranged attacks, but standing back and chucking a few firebombs does wonders for clearing out big numbers of them. And for me, one of the most enjoyable things to do in any Soulsborne game is taking out several enemies at once with some grand sweep or high damage AoE attack. I thought this fight would be even easier with a Sorcerer, but to my surprise this was not the case, because the area of effect for firebombs is much wider than that of Flame Toss, and so instead of hitting 6 enemies at once, I was hitting 1. Really great first boss with the perfect level of difficulty, because while you certainly can die here if you get careless and charge straight in, once you figure out the strat, it's easy meat. The core itself can't even damage you. As is the case with every boss in this game, after beating it, touching the newly formed Archstone will get you a Demon Soul, except instead of Soul of Sif or Soul of Nashandra, they have a different naming convention here, usually featuring some adjective that in some way describes the boss, like Wriggling Demon Soul, Swollen Demon Soul, Searing Demon Soul, etc. Though, like I said, don't expect much in the way of boss lore from these item descriptions. This first level of Boletaria is superb and is the perfect introduction to the game. It certainly is challenging due to the player's low stats at this point, but not too challenging, and while the enemies here can do big damage, their movesets are quite easy to quickly get to grips with so as to avoid that damage, and the game also communicates to the player that as well as actual enemies, the player should expect other types of hazards too, like dragons, traps and falls. Furthermore, even though there are no intermediary checkpoints situated within any one level in Demon Souls, 1-1 features 2 different shortcuts to unlock so as to lessen that feeling of frustration after a death towards the end of the level, and shortcuts appear in most other levels too. At this point you can return back to the Nexus via the Archstone to get things properly started. For one, the Maiden in Black is now a character we can interact with, whereas before she only appeared in a cutscene. Before being able to properly use her though, got to visit the only remaining monumental residing on the upper level of the Nexus, providing the player with more exposition on the nature of the world, the soul arts and the old one, but I already covered this stuff earlier on in the video. I've already handled this. The monumental is very important from a story perspective though, providing some crucial details about the nature of the old one, at least what little details there are. More importantly, from a gameplay perspective though, is that you can now level up at the Maiden, though beforehand she asks if you're even interested in the power to level up, which I don't really understand. Yes, obviously, the answer's yes. Regarding the Nexus, it's certainly not my favourite hub area, though at the same time I can totally understand why some people might love it, especially if you have a lot of nostalgia associated with the place. One aspect of it that I'm not a big fan of is how empty it is. You've got your bottom floor which starts off fairly populated and becomes even more so as you rescue characters like Sage Frake, Saint Urbane and Yuria the Witch, but then there's the second floor which remains almost entirely empty for the whole game, apart from 2 exceptions, one of which is extremely missable if you're not going around killing friendly NPCs to lower your player tendency, something I'd never actually done before this very playthrough. That said, I am very fond of Stockpile Thomas and Blacksmith Baldwin, and I'd end up visiting these two every time I return to the Nexus. Regarding Thomas, when this remake was first announced I wondered if they were even going to include this guy in the same manner, because I honestly assumed Bluepoint might scrap the item burden mechanic altogether, but nope, it's still here, and while I've never been a fan of item burden, clearly a sentiment shared by FromSoft, seeing as how they never included it in any future games, it really did not negatively affect my enjoyment of this playthrough at all. Not least of all because you can now send any items or equipment off to storage if it's too heavy, whereas in the original game, you just had to fucking leave it there. Still, I do enjoy coming back to the Nexus after beating a level with a bag full of mail breakers and upgrade materials and dropping them all off at Thomas. Although heavy armour and large shields and such can take up massive space in your bag, surprisingly grass ends up being the most egregious space taker, especially due to the 6 different kinds of it, with the more potent grasses being heavy as fuck here compared to in the original where they were all extremely light. Regarding the healing system in Demon Souls, it's certainly very different to what FromSoft would later implement with its Estus Flask, Healing Gourd and Crimson Tears. Of course, all healing is done with grass here, unless you're using miracles, and those grasses do not automatically replenish. Furthermore, unlike the simplified non-replenishing healing found in Bloodborne with its blood vials, Demon Souls has 6 different varieties, the weakest of which is Crescent Moon, which becomes near useless towards the end of the game, all the way up to Darkmoon Grass, which fully heals HP and cures any of the game's 3 different status ailments, all of which simply do damage over time by the way, with Bleeding being the weakest and Plague being the strongest. My opinions on grass have shifted a fair bit since I first played Demon Souls around a decade ago, all the way to when I last played it a week ago, but now I've actually grown to like it. The main element of irritation I've often had with it is simply running out of the bloody stuff, and from my experience this is most likely to happen near the beginning of the game, because while enemies will be dropping Crescent and Half Moon Grass left, right and centre in 1-1, this is certainly not the case in the other worlds. In fact, the game's worlds seem to be implemented in such a way that if you're low on a particular resource, rather than just soldiering on through the game, you can visit a corresponding world where that resource is more frequently dropped. So, Boletaria is great for farming grass, Stonefang Tunnel is the best place for upgrade materials, Latria is great for spice items for regenerating MP, the Shrine of Storms is the best for farming souls, and the Valley of Defilement is perfect for... Now, I'm speaking generally here because you can find individual spots within the other worlds that might be particularly useful for farming certain resources more associated with the other worlds, but the point is, once you accept that you might need to do a wee bit of farming from time to time and that it's all just part of the game, the experience does feel a lot smoother. That said, item discovery goes a long way in this game, and while I ran out of grass quite early on, from the midpoint onwards I always had much more than I needed. And once I started using the ridiculously powerful large sword of searching towards the end, I had more grass than I knew what to do with. I had too much grass, if anything. Back to our adventure though. Now that 1-1 is cleared, the player is free to visit any other world, though they're certainly not all the same level of difficulty as Boletaria, not from a combat standpoint or a level navigation one. A logical enough way to handle these when playing is to simply go 1-1, 2-1, 3-1 and so on, but I'll just cover each world in its entirety before moving on to the next for this retrospective. 1-2 is super unique as far as its layout is concerned because pretty much the whole level takes place on a bridge, so essentially your goal is to just move forward, taking care not to get roasted by the red dragon on the way to the more fortified sections in between. Though items have been temptingly strewn at various points along the bridge and you think this has got to be something good, but no, it's just one Crescent Moon Grass. Although the level does just take place on a long bridge, I still think it exhibits excellent level design, because the first crossing is easily manageable if you just time it right before moving, whereas you have, as far as I know, zero chance of making the second crossing, which is about twice the length of the first, and with more items too. Thus, you have to travel either above ground or through the tunnel within the base of the bridge, depending on what the dragon's doing at the time. Ostrava makes another appearance and once again needs saving by us, and this theme will continue throughout the whole of Boletaria, where despite his shiny golden armour, weapon and shield, he keeps needing the help of the player. I guess Ostrava was kind of a precursor to Siegmeyer from Dark Souls 1, only less oniony. And apparently oniony is an actual word, so that's pretty cool, As big a pain in the ass as the dragon is in 1-2... Hold on, that just doesn't sound right. As big a pain in the arse as the dragon is in 1-2, you can significantly nullify the challenge from this level by just killing the fucking thing, though the method for doing so is really boring and requires a decent bow and a lot of arrows. I think this took me about 10 minutes straight, and so I just muted my TV and listened to some Matt and Shane's secret podcast until the thing died. I like that you can kill the dragon and that you can even get a unique soul for achieving this, but it's hardly a very satisfying or engaging fight. That said, it feels good to just run across the whole bridge afterwards and collect all the goodies without being burnt. There's a new character here too if you return later after collecting a set of keys from the next level, allowing us to free Bior of the Twin Fangs, who's been kept in captivity by an overweight official.
You deserve a handsome reward, only I have none.
This guy's great. Seriously though, you do need to pay me back. Like Ostrava and several other characters, Bjorn will appear back in the Nexus for some extra dialogue after he's freed, and what's more is that he reappears back in Boletaria near the end of the game in a way that manages to be both awesome and really stupid at the same time. The boss of 1-2 is one of my favourites, that being the Tower Knight, a fight which FromSoft would later pay homage to with the one reborn from Bloodborne. Bluepoint really did this boss justice. The knight just looks incredible, especially with how its projectiles look and sound. As good as they look though, these projectiles are also kind of perplexing. I mean, has anyone ever even been hit by one of these? For me, they miss every fucking time because of the wall up here, and so you can just walk around and not get hit. That said, I made the mistake of getting cocky up close and got nailed by its massive shield. I've always considered the Tower Knight to be an easy boss, and it is easy, as long as you don't get hit. Speaking of getting hit, there's nothing more irritating than finally knocking it down but getting knocked down yourself by the blast as it falls, wasting precious slamming time. Despite beating the Tower Knight, access to 1-3 is actually blocked off by a fog gate which will only disappear after you defeat an archdemon in one of the other worlds, much like how certain areas of Lordran are sealed off until you place the Lord Vessel in Dark Souls 1. Not entirely sure why they did this, to be honest, because there's another level in Boletaria after this one, but 1-3 is a challenging area for sure. Enemies suddenly start doing significantly more damage, there are more obese officials than ever before, and now the much more difficult red-eyed knights have replaced their blue-eyed brethren. You can actually get the full blue-eyed knight set in this game too, even the helmet, but it makes this horrible fucking noise whenever you put it on, and so I just stopped wearing it. It's a cool effect for the first 5 minutes, but then I say enough. Although the layout of the last level took on a distinctly linear form, 1-3 is far more back in line with the layout of 1-1, featuring some proper castle navigation and exploration, and with absolutely fiendish enemy placements. Some folk talk about Demon's Souls being one of the easier Soulsborne titles, and while this is true to some degree, particularly with the bosses, there are still some really difficult moments throughout the actual levels. I'm not great at games in general, but I do have over a decade's worth of experience playing these games, and so I like to think I'm a somewhat more than decent Souls player. Maybe? Well then, why do I feel the instant urge to run away in terror when I see a red-eyed knight? These dudes terrify me, especially when there's 3 of them at once. Of course, FromSoft would later go on to recreate this notorious stairs section in Dark Souls 3 on top of Lothric Castle, but I still think this version of them is harder. Just as we freed Bjorn in 1-2, there's another very special character locked up in Boletaria, and that is Yuria the Witch. Just as Dark Souls 3 paid heavy tribute to the castle stairs part of Demon's Souls, they went and did the exact same thing with Carla the Witch, with both being held in captivity for their heretical beliefs, both wearing very similar clothing, and both offering the player particularly powerful spells which can't be obtained elsewhere. The method of actually accessing Yuria is brilliant too, requiring you to don a full set of official's gear to activate these stairs, and the fat official up here is even non-hostile too while you're wearing this stuff. This is an example of one of the few things Bluepoint actually added to the game too, because in the original you could only get the official's hat, not the full set. The boss of 1-3 is the Penetrator, with some of the sickest armour in the game, not to mention an awesome weapon. Speaking of weapons, one aspect of Demon's Souls I've always found to be a bit odd is that you can get multiple copies of special weapons. For example, you can get the penetrating sword in 1-3 and then another one in 1-4. You could also get 2 copies of the Hiltless, 2 tower shields and 2 white bows, and the same is true of rings. By the time I'd finished the game, I had 3 thief rings, 2 grave robbers rings, 2 rings of the accursed and more. I guess it's not really bad that you can get so many. It's just a bit strange, because you only need 1. The Penetrator might be the most conventional boss in the game, essentially just being a powerful knight. They did change up his design a bit for the remake though. For one, the blood and fire effects on his weapon weren't there at all in the original game. I do like these changes though. The boss just feels heavier here, if you know what I mean. If you know what I mean. Although his design is great and it is a fun fight, I've never considered the Penetrator to be a particularly interesting fight, because it's just way too easy and will often spam that same twirling attack. And that attack's a deceptive one too, because although it looks like a 2-hit combo, I don't think that first twirl is actually an attack. it's just a flourish meant to make you roll and then get hit by the follow-up, a trick that I usually fall for, to be honest. Now, although there is another level in Boletaria, it leads up to the final boss, and so I'm going to come back to this level at the end. For now, I'd like to move on to the next Archstone. Compared to Boletaria, Stonefang Tunnel is a completely different type of world with completely different types of enemies. Whereas Boletaria put you up against knights, dreglings and dragons, Stonefang is filled with scaly, soul-starved miners working away at the rock with both their bare hands and pickaxes, encouraged onto greater endeavour by the cruel, cackling, plump officials. The miners are everywhere in Stonefang, essentially just working away and minding their own bloody business until we enter into the picture. But their main characteristic is that they are highly resistant to all types of physical damage except for pierce damage from things like rapiers or spears. I remember playing this back in the day and getting frustrated that I was doing such terrible damage to these dudes, especially due to the sheer number of them within the tunnel. Then a friend told me that you were supposed to use pierce damage on them, and since you're very likely to have picked up at least one Mailbreaker back in 1.1, it makes them way more manageable. I noticed that they'd added these 2 red message signs in the remake, letting you know that they're highly vulnerable to both pierce damage and magic damage, but then I discovered that these were actually there in the original too, and that I somehow missed them. Whoops. As useful as a rapier is here, it still doesn't really make these enemies very enjoyable to fight. The most efficient way to take them out is with a backstab, and that looks like this. This just isn't very satisfying combat to me, and I'm also not a big fan of getting just 3 souls per enemy killed. That being said, a magic build is pure easy mode in Stonefang, and the tiny MP cost of Soul Arrow combined with its big damage makes it perfect for taking out rooms full of these things. I fucking hate the dogs in Demon Souls though. Holy shit. Dogs have always been considered a major irritant in Soulsborne games, but they are bloody cancerous in this game. I died 4 times here, and that's nothing compared to the part within the bridge in 1.2 where the game throws 5 of them at you at once in a tight enclosed space. 2.1 is also where most players are likely to see their first fat official, 2 in total of which are found in 2.1, with another being found in 2.2. These are the first enemies the player is likely to face who also have the ability to use magic, though these attacks are purely fire based. Bear in mind that pyromancy wouldn't become its own thing until Dark Souls 1. Although there are a bunch of them throughout Boletaria Castle, it's extra important to kill each fat official throughout Stonefang because this is how you get the official set necessary for freeing Uria. As much as I'm not a big fan of the minor enemies, they are of course very thematically appropriate to the level, with them being soul-starved and subservient to the fat officials towards gathering more souls for the archdemons and the Old One. Despite their rather inhuman appearance, it's implied that this transformation took place after the colourless fog swept over the land, hence how we see that the still human blacksmith Ed is in the process of this transformation, though his craft as a blacksmith has kept him with a steady supply of souls to stop him from going mad. We see this from other vendors in the game too, who've managed to stop themselves from going totally soul-starved and insane through selling items and equipment for souls. Speaking of Blacksmith Ed, in another satisfying flourish of level design, a shortcut can be activated from the upper level of the tunnels to not only provide easy access back up from just near the Archstone in case you die to one of those fucking fire lizards, but it also opens the way to Blacksmith Ed on the lower level, brother of Baldwin, back in the Nexus. An aspect that I certainly like about Demon Souls is that loads of the characters here have Scottish accents, whereas most NPCs in Dark Souls and Bloodborne have English accents before Elden Ring came along and made everyone Welsh. Surely can't be too long now before the Irish properly have their time to shine, although let's not forget about Gilligan and Gascoigne, I suppose. Whereas Baldwin can perform basic upgrades on your weapons, more specialised upgrades have to be performed by Ed here. Same with weapon transmogrification, though that particular feature isn't available just yet. I'll talk a bit more about transmogrification and upgrading a bit later on, but I kinda like that there are 2 blacksmiths in the game, one of whom is right there on the Nexus and easily accessible, and the other of which is just living here in this random fucking hot hole. With the idea behind this world being that it's a tunnel for mining, as expected there's a decent degree of delving deeper down into its dark depths, both in 2.1 and 2.2, via elevator or even just by leaping down and desperately trying not to die from the platforming or the accumulated slivers of fall damage. Speaking of fall damage, it can be mitigated by raising your dexterity stat of all things in Demon Souls, and it even tells you this on the level up screen. Back when I first started getting into the Souls games, a lot of its mechanics were initially lost on me because I'd simply never encountered them before, and because the game just kinda expects you to know some stuff. And so things like invincibility frames, equip load and weapon scaling all just kinda went over my head. In fact, I used to think that fat rolling was just something that automatically happened when you put on heavy armour or used a really heavy weapon or shield, before a friend explained equip load to me. It's all part of the fun though, isn't it? Figuring stuff out, or in my case just not figuring it out at all until someone else explains it to me. At the bottom of the elevator at the end of 1-1 we fight the Armour Spider. Certainly not my favourite boss in the game, though the aspect of it being fixed in place and only able to attack from the one position is rather interesting, because it makes a defensive playstyle far less viable, forcing you to get very close indeed as a melee player where you've got to dodge high damage cleaves from its bladed legs, or if you're a filthy magic user, you've got fireballs to dodge, iron bursts of 1 or 3. The attack the Armour Spider does, which stops me from liking it all that much, is the one where it douses the ground in oil before setting it aflame, forcing you to just run away and wait till it all goes out. The issue is that it's way too easy to avoid, and it's one of those attacks where your one and only option is to run away and spend a good 25 seconds not engaging the boss, and the repeated cycles of running close, dodging fireballs and webs, getting a few hundred points of damage, run away from its oil attack, and repeat all feels a bit too machine-like. I prefer bosses where its AI is a bit less obvious. Or maybe I'm just a salty bitch from losing all my health in one attack. Although 2-1 can be quite challenging to navigate with its levers, lifts and backtracking, 2-2 is far more complex, with enclosed branching tunnels leading to large rooms of molten lava, and I'd say this is also the most vertically complex level in the game. It's a bit of an odd one too, because if you just want to go straight to the boss, it really doesn't take all that long to reach the fog wall. It's perilous as fuck, sure, but you can skip most of the level just by running past all the miners and hopping down the wooden platforms, then probably plummeting to your doom at least once before trying again and hopefully making it all the way down without dying. The left hand path leads to a whole other optional area though, with great opportunities to pick up more upgrade materials, though there are 2 kind of random black phantoms whose exact weapon and shield I was using by coincidence. Mind you, I came back here again later on after beating them, and one of them was just lying inert on the ground and could not be interacted with, so not sure what the hell was happening here. Maybe a bug? The tunnels here are some of my least favourite sections to play through in the game. They're not bad or anything, they suck and are frustrating to get lost in, and contain some super weird enemies in the form of the bear bugs. These things have a lot of HP and a ridiculous defense that even the Mailbreaker cannot penetrate, though apparently magic works really well on them. The issue arises when you don't have any magic, leaving you with the option of either spending 5 to 10 minutes whittling down their health, much like the Red Dragon, or just leaving them entirely. I ended up killing this one, and then killing another one further on through the tunnels where Patches makes his appearance, except looking way uglier than he has in any of the other games. To tell you the truth, I do not care for the facial animations in the remake at all. They are heavily within Uncanny Valley territory, with the abrupt way one expression transitions into another, and you can always see too much of their teeth. It's like Bluepoint tried to make the animations really realistic, but that style just doesn't fit here, and also they don't look realistic. In fact, they often look really weird. The boss of 2-2 is the Flamelurker, who in my opinion succeeds in being the most difficult boss in the game while also not being shit, which is not something I can say for a certain other difficult Demon Souls boss. I think the biggest challenge here is being bold enough to try and nail the dodge timings for his AoE attacks rather than frantically rolling away and probably getting hit anyway. It's difficult because you can roll well clear of an actual punch or slam but still take big damage anyway from the explosions. I was doing horrendous damage with my Great Club here, but I remembered that the Flamelurker is weak as hell to magic damage, and indeed this is one of those bosses that feels completely different if you're a magic user, whereas it can be a proper problem for melee players. I do seem to remember the Flamelurker being way more aggressive back on the PS3 though, but it's possible I'm just misremembering that. Although it is a particularly challenging fight, the the boss soul you get from the Flamelurker is unique among all others in that it's required for transmogrification of regular weapons into boss weapons, though I have no doubt that countless players had absolutely no idea about this, and perhaps just popped the boss soul after seeing that it can't be exchanged for any new spells or miracles back in the Nexus. To be fair, Ed does mention that a special demon soul of scorching heat is needed to bless weapons, but this dialogue is easy to miss and you have to exhaust Ed's dialogue before he will even accept the Flamelurker's soul. Like in Dark Souls 1, the creation of boss weapons can be a fair bit more laborious than the methods featured in Dark Souls 2, 3 and Elden Ring. Whereas in the later titles all you had to do was hand in a boss soul to get an awesome new weapon, the earlier games made you level up a regular weapon of a specific type first and only then can it be transformed. This can really be a pain when you take into account the crazy number of resources needed to upgrade equipment in Demon Souls. Some people complained about the large investment of smithing stones needed in Elden Ring, and they did have a point, though at the same time you've got to remember that it did let you upgrade to plus 25, so of course you're going to need a lot of materials. In Demon Souls though, the max upgrade level is just plus 10, but here the game can require as many as 3 different levels of upgrade materials for just the one upgrade level. For example, upgrading my Colossus to plus 8 required 4 sharpstone shards, 3 large sharpstone shards and 2 sharpstone chunks, and so as you might expect, you've got to be prepared to do a ton of resource farming in this game, especially with the more exotic upgrade paths, of which Demon Souls has a surprising variety, including ones which never appeared again in any more FromSoft games, like the Dark upgrade path, which is specifically for shields, or the Fatal upgrade path, which increases a weapon's critical damage. Going for these ones does mean farming for more elusive materials though, and I have distinct memories from years ago of spending a damn hour or two farming these slug enemies for Sucker Stone for my Tearing Uchigatana, and let's not even talk about the ridiculous struggle of obtaining a pure Blade Stone. I think the complexity of the upgrade system of Demon Souls is really interesting, especially with all the very specific upgrade paths on offer, but I do prefer the more streamlined iteration of it which would appear in Dark Souls 1, which would of course become increasingly streamlined with every subsequent Soulsborne game, up until Elden Ring, where there are only 2 main classes of upgrade material, instead of fucking 7, each of which are further divided into shards, large shards, chunks, and then a very rare pure ore for the final upgrade. Back to the boss weapons though, I wanted to use a couple that I'd never experimented with before, and so tried out the absurdly heavy Dozer Axe, which absolutely flattened enemies, though surprisingly it has no scaling whatsoever, which I've never been a fan of. Also, you cannot upgrade boss weapons whatsoever in Demon Souls, so the only way to improve their effectiveness really is with scaling. I still did have plenty of fun with the Dozer Axe, though later on I decided to try out the large Sword of Searching, which ended up trivialising the remainder of the game. Seriously, this thing is borderline overpowered, or even flat out overpowered. Great base damage and range, a moveset that seems way too quick for the weapon's size. It does bleed build up, and it also doubles your item discovery, which in this game is huge because it means you never need to worry about running out of grass again. Returning back to Stonefang, now that its 2 levels have been beaten, that just leaves its final challenge, that being this world's archdemon, the Dragon God. I have very conflicting past experiences with the Dragon God, and I'm not even sure why, but when I first got a PS5 and was fighting this boss for the first time in the remake, I think I died to it about 20 times at least. Of course, this is a gimmick fight, being very similar in essence to the Bed of Chaos, with it requiring an attack from the left and right before going in and attacking from the middle, all with the constant risk of instant death. The way to avoid that death is to only move from pillar to pillar when the dragon is looking away from you, made more difficult with the stone obstructions which first need to be cleared, and made especially difficult with the fact that it's kinda hard to know when you're actually out of eyeshot of the Dragon God. It doesn't even have eyes facing out the front of its head, but instead they're at the sides, so I found it oddly difficult to determine when it was safe to run out in front of the next pillar. I remember coming out of that fight absolutely hating this boss and having just as low an opinion of it as I did the Bed of Chaos, and even wishing they'd changed something about it for the remake, but surprisingly I nailed it on my first try on this playthrough, and so I'm currently at the point in my mind where I can't be sure whether this boss fucking sucks or I suck. You be the judge. Whichever it is, this is really not a fun or engaging boss. It looks incredible, and I love how the game shows you how powerful this archdemon really is, with the way just its breath can damage or even kill you if you're careless at the end, but it's not a boss I ever look forward to, and I'm always glad when the fight is over. With the Dragon God's demise, that means we're largely done with Stonefang Tunnel, and moving to the next Archstone takes us to the Tower of Latria, with its first level being the Prison of Hope. Just as Stonefang Tunnel was of a completely different flavour from Boletaria Castle, the Tower of Latria is a very different flavour still. And this world is where you start to see how dark and disturbing demon souls can be. This place is absolutely joyless. It's filled with maddened, soul-starved prisoners, and it's arguably the most difficult level in the game to navigate, with 10 different keys being required to unlock all the prison cells, some of which contain optional NPCs, some with treasure, and others having no rewards at all. Much of the level design in the Prison of Hope revolves around progressing through a section with many locked cells, finding the key for that section further ahead, and then doubling back and opening everything, sometimes making a very welcome shortcut available too. The main difficulty with navigating through this level is how similar everything looks, not just the east and west sections of each floor, but also the different floors themselves, though as you traverse through it all a few times, either from getting a bit lost or just from dying, the layout gradually does become more discernible. Still, the feeling of getting far in 3-1 and then dying far into the fucking level sucks when you're still not all that familiar with it, because if you get hopelessly lost again on the way, or have an inopportune encounter with a mind flayer, kiss that bloodstain goodbye. As intricate and challenging as the level navigation here is, the mind flayers make it much harder, and the constricted nature of the level adds to the challenge of dealing with their projectile attacks. One of the most frustrating things which can happen in this game is the classic combo of getting paralysed, sucked, and then AoE'd right as you're getting up, and they'd go on to implement a very similar enemy type in Bloodborne with the Brain Suckers. Things do start getting more distinctive down at the bottom floor though, where the layout becomes somewhat more open, and there's a very morbid enemy here taken straight from Berserk. Speaking of Berserk, if anyone's watching this who's thought about checking it out but just never got round to it, please do yourself a favour and do get round to it. As many folks on YouTube have already documented, there are a ton of elements in the FromSoft games which were heavily inspired by Berserk, and there's a very good reason for that. Berserk is fucking incredible, beautifully drawn and very dark. If you enjoy the more disturbing aspects of Soulsborne lore, then you will be right at home with Berserk. Past the prisoner hold awaits a statue of Queen Latria herself, which opens up down the middle, firing volleys of arrows 2 at a time. I love that they used a rather unthreatening basic design for the statue here before it transforms, rather than making it monstrous, which then opens up to become even more threatening and monstrous. It kinda goes back to that classic FromSoft design decision of juxtaposing beauty with horror, a theme which in my opinion is often far more compelling than just making everything morbid and horrific. Although this section is clearly designed to encourage the player to find an alternate path around the statue, hence the Warden's key sitting right there. It's entirely possible to time your rolls correctly here and iframe your way through the arrows, not entirely unlike just dodging through the Executioner's chariot in Dark Souls 2. Though you can just march straight into the boss ahead, that would not be a good idea, because just above the boss room sits this guy who will simply revive the boss anytime you kill it. This fella isn't really all that well hidden, and I'd imagine most players are quite likely to encounter him before the boss anyway, if they're diligent in exploring, as any good Souls player should be. And also, there's even a message in the boss arena giving the player a hint that there's something fishy going on, but regardless, I always appreciate an additional external element to a boss that can affect its difficulty level, and for all its faults, I loved that about Dark Souls 2, because it did interesting stuff like that all the time with its bosses. The Fool's Idol is a weird one for me, because I always remember her being piss easy back when I played this game on the PS3. I have strong memories of just running up to her and depleting all her health before she had a chance to do damn near anything back to me, but I actually found her to be a massive pain in the arse here. In fact, she actually killed me on my magic character. I just kept getting stuck on the damn floor traps whenever I was moving around the arena trying to find the real version of her once she started duplicating, and it got really frustrating. However, I eventually realised that it's actually easy to tell which is the real version of the boss, because unlike the real Fool's Idol, the fake ones have a small health bar which appears when you lock on. Really nice, subtle touch there, which makes a massive difference to the boss's difficulty if you're observant enough to notice it. After beating her, we get the Doll Demon Soul, and this one is important for magic users because it can be used to get the Soul Ray spell, at least after first unlocking Sage Frake from his cell with his special key. I imagine Sage Frake is the first time many players will first try out exchanging their boss souls for something special, because Saint Urbane isn't till 4-2, and as covered, you can't exchange boss souls for weapons until after beating the Flamelurker. A very cool touch with some boss souls is that the spell you can exchange them for will differ depending on whether you ask the religious Saint Urbane, the scholarly Sage Frake, or the heretical witch Uria, with Urbane specialising in miracles, while Uria sells some of the most powerful spells. By the way, miracles are far more defensive and healing oriented in Demon Souls compared to the later games. Not to mention that a third of the miracles on offer have effects which specifically target online phantoms, while most of the others are for healing and curing. In fact, there's literally only one miracle in the game which directly does damage, and that's Wrath of God, or pardon me, God's Wrath. Not that any of this matters anyway, because Saint Urbane wouldn't even sell me any miracles due to my faith stat not being high enough. Prick. After beating the Fool's Idol in a scene I'd somehow completely forgotten about, we're seized by a trio of gargoyles and lifted skyward. I'd always thought the repetition of the gargoyle thing in Dark Souls 3 was meant as an homage to Dark Souls 1, but I guess Demon Souls did it first, a statement that's true for a lot of Soulsborne ideas. As grim as the Prison of Hope was, this world's second level is genuinely horrific, and in my opinion the most disturbing level in the game. There are certainly more disgusting levels later on, but Upper Latria is something else. Almost every enemy we fight here is monstrous in some way, while also clearly having been made that way by some cruel demon, as evidenced by the human souls which drop upon death, or the human faces crudely and cruelly stitched onto enormous and grotesque insect-like bodies, both large and small, perhaps resembling adults and children. Yet again, Demon Souls introduces another level with a very unique layout, to the extent that its design can't really be compared to anything else in the game. Traversal is done via travelling from tower to chained tower, ascending up or descending down where the paths break off into nothing. The main goal in Upper Latria is to interrupt the two rituals going on at separate towers, each causing one of the level's many chains to break off from the amorphous, throbbing collection of flesh at the tower's core. This thing actually has a heartbeat of sorts when you get close to it, and it's gross. Although much of the level involves crossing desolate walkways along the upper level, there's also a lower level which somehow manages to be even more fucked up than the area above it, and featuring the second of the game's only two prisoner horde enemies. Though before descending down there within the cage, we meet a very suspicious character, Yurt the Silent Chief. Just like in Bloodborne, upon talking to this dude, every fibre of your being screams, "This is a bad idea," but of course, you let him out anyway, because as players we are curious. Still, as badass and dark as Yurt looks and sounds, there's nothing particularly threatening about the way he just aimlessly wanders around up here after you free him, and even if you die and return back here later on like I did, he's still here. If you return back to the Nexus though, there will be a couple dead bodies who weren't here before. I could have sworn these corpses weren't here before. And sure enough, if you talk to Yurt hidden away on the upper floor, not only does he give you no reward, but he heavily implies that he's going to kill you too at some point, so probably best to take him out. I do really like that they placed him discreetly in the corner on the upper part of the Nexus though, because I imagine there must have been some players who saw friendly NPCs in the Nexus being picked off one by one, and important ones too, but just not knowing why it was happening or how to stop it. The reason for actually interrupting the two rituals and dropping the flesh is to allow access further up the tower so as to fight the boss. Though FromSoft were absolute fiends here and put a goddamn black phantom mind flare on the narrow stairway leading up. Oh, you thought you'd seen the last of these things back in the prison? No! Speaking of the enemies here, they're a bit of a mixed bag, though in particular I'm talking about the gargoyles, who have some garbage AI. Sometimes they just don't really do anything, whereas other times they keep bloody flying off, and then back again, and then off again, and the crossbow ones were the weirdest of them all. Towards the end of the level, I just started running past these things because I couldn't be bothered dealing with their erratic movements. Unfortunately, all this talk of questionable AI is relevant nowhere as much as with the boss of 3.2, the Maneaters. Let me just start off by saying that I think this is hands down the worst boss in the game. There are a few underwhelming bosses found elsewhere, and certainly an annoying boss or two, but the only one that I think is flat out awful is this one, and it's almost entirely because of its AI. This is a very difficult fight for me, and always has been. It all takes place on a somewhat narrow walkway, restricting your ability to roll around freely to avoid attacks, and as well as this, several of the Maneaters' attacks will violently knock you back if they connect, adding to the frustration, and to top it all off, a second one appears partway into the fight. All these elements make for a challenging and frustrating fight, which is not necessarily in itself a bad thing, but it's the way the bosses behave which makes this fight a joke. One will often just fly the fuck away for a while before coming back, all for no apparent reason, and when it does return to the walkway, it's common to see it awkwardly land on a pillar in a way that just doesn't look right, before something's just flying off again, or even standing there for a few seconds doing nothing and out of reach of your weapon. Also, when in the middle of flight, they'll occasionally throw out a random mid-air attack, nowhere even close to you, except with the same lunging animation it uses when grounded, making it look ridiculous as it launches itself from nothing in mid-air. You can have a fight with shitty boss AI, or you can have a challenging and somewhat frustrating boss fight, but when you combine the two it makes for an awful gaming experience. The Maneaters were a bad boss back in the PS3 days, but I would argue that they're even worse here, because the janky animations and nonsensical behaviour look horrendous when presented with the remake's pristine graphics. I wish Bluepoint would have done something to improve this, because while Demon's Souls is a great game and many people's favourite, it's sure as hell not a perfect game. I'm not saying I wanted Bluepoint to start taking creative liberties everywhere, but would anyone have actually complained if they had fixed this boss fight? I really doubt it. Just as the end of 2.2 led directly to the archdemon of that level, the same is largely true for the Tower of Latria, except with one last staircase of enemies to fight through, featuring not one, but two Black Phantom Mind Flayers. No. I really didn't love this, because it makes it scary as hell if you die in the boss room with a fuckload of souls and have to fight through two of these things again on the way back, which is exactly what happened to me. The Old Monk is a pretty interesting fight in theory, particularly if you're playing online, but if you are playing it offline, it might just be the least interesting boss in the game. Instead of the towering dragon god we fought before, the archdemon here is a large yellow robe which removes itself from its current host before possessing either another player if you're online, or just a boring old NPC with claws if offline like me. I've got nothing to say about this fight, to be honest, it's just meh. Though compared to the boss which came directly before it, it's a big improvement. And so folks, that's nearly 3 of the game's 5 archstones completed. Now, while Boletaria Castle is the exception with 4 levels, the other 4 worlds actually only have 2 levels each and then a final boss, making Demon's Souls a surprisingly short game. In saying that though, it's really not just a case of soldiering through each level and then never looking back, because certain aspects can be changed within those levels depending on your actions. And so before talking about the 4th and 5th archstones, I would like to discuss World Tendency. World Tendency has to be the most esoteric mechanic in Demon's Souls. There is nothing within the actual game that explains what it is or how it works. There's nothing which attempts to explain what it does, and the game doesn't even tell you how to alter it. All you have is this somewhat mystifying screen accessible from the start menu, showing the 5 archstones as well as strange symbols below each one, and then of course you have your player tendency, which is a separate thing entirely. World Tendency is so mysterious that I'm betting most of the folk who've played Demon's Souls have never engaged with it or even understood how to engage with it, simply experiencing its effects by chance, if at all, especially back in the day when access to wikis and such was more limited. To provide a bit of an explanation, each world has its own separate tendency, which I guess is somewhat comparable to a karma system, although it's not exactly like that, because that would imply that it goes up if you do something good, and down if you do something evil, and last I checked, dying isn't really evil. There are 7 different levels of world tendency, ranging from pure black at the lowest up to pure white at the highest, and with each raising or lowering of the tendency through your actions in that world, certain modifiers will be adjusted in the background, affecting that world's difficulty. Modifiers such as your max HP when in soul form, the damage done by enemies, the spawning of extra black phantoms, etc. Though going towards black world tendency does also increase the number of souls received from enemies as well as their drop rate, kinda like going with the pitch black light level in Darkest Dungeon. While these modifiers are pretty cool, they're not all that major, though the black phantoms which show up can be a major pain in the arse. Due to the fact that dying moves your tendency towards black, the game actually does punish you for playing poorly, which is interesting to say the least, but I like this aspect. There's something refreshing about this sort of thing when you consider how sickeningly hand-holdy many of your modern AAA titles have become. Also, Demon's Souls isn't that hard. It's a tough game for sure, yes, but it's nothing crazy, even at pure black world tendency. The effects that were far more interesting to me were those that only show up when you're either a pure black or pure white. One example is the area with the 2 dragons back on 1-1, with the red one of course preventing easy access to the treasures here. Well, if you come here after getting pure white world tendency, the dragons will be gone from here entirely, allowing you to just pick the stuff up. Another example is the closed gate at the start of this same level which will only open with either white tendency or black tendency, allowing access to the area and special enemy within. Or you have that dude in 3-1 who's constantly shouting for someone to help, though there is of course no key anywhere in this level which actually opens up his cell. If you come here with pure black tendency, Rydell will attack the player as a black phantom, but if you have pure white tendency, in 3-2 a small, normally inaccessible part of the level, past some broken stairs, will suddenly have a wooden plank, allowing access across, beyond which lies the key to open Rydell's cell back in 3-1. The NPC aspect happens several times actually, with pure black often spawning in characters as enemies who will attack the player on sight, whereas pure white will have them as friendly NPCs to be interacted with, and with an accompanying quest. A very interesting entity which will appear at one particular spot at one level within each world until killed is the primeval demons, with these bizarre beings being one of the only ways to obtain the colourless demon souls required to upgrade certain special weapons like the penetrating sword or white bow. I call them entities rather than enemies because they don't actually attack you at all, they just sort of sit there looking like the brain bugs from Starship Troopers. To be honest, this playthrough was actually my first ever time even seeing one of these things for real, and that's because of what you have to go through to actually achieve pure black or pure white, which is at the core of why I am not a big fan of world tendency. So the main way to move your world tendency towards white is to beat a boss, and in fact by the time you beat all the bosses of a world, your world tendency there will be pure white. Isn't that great? Well, that is unless you die of course, because dying is the main method of moving your tendency towards black, and I hate this. For one, you can get properly fucked out of achieving pure white if you die too much, because at some point, well, you're going to run out of bosses, aren't you? And when this happens, unless you're up for some PvP, you can get into a state where you just can't get your tendency up any higher towards white for a particular world because you died a few times while in human form. This aspect of it is very important because world tendency will only move towards black if you die while human. It's not affected if you die whilst in soul form, and so what some folk do is once they regain their human form after beating a boss, they kill themselves in the Nexus where there is no world tendency, so as to move back towards soul form so that there is no risk of screwing up your tendency for that world. And in a similar vein, if you want pure black tendency, then get ready to deliberately kill yourself several times on each level, using up your stones of ephemeral eyes. Any system where a main way of manipulating it is through strategic dying is just not one I have a great deal of interest in engaging with. I think the difficulty modifiers are a really cool background feature, and I really like the events the game offers when in pure white or pure black, but while I was a couple of minutes into throwing myself off a cliff to lower my world tendency for a chance to see these extra events, I couldn't help but think, this is shit and I don't want to do it. And indeed, that's why I've never fucked with world tendency before this playthrough, other than by chance, and why I will probably never fuck with it again in the future. That said, if you're a PvP person, then some of my criticism of this mechanic doesn't quite apply, because you can shift your tendency towards white by killing invaders, though at the same time you do need to be in body form to be invaded, meaning that if you're really shit at PvP but are trying to achieve pure white, you might just end up with pure black due to dying. As well as world tendency, there's also character tendency, which is specific to your player rather than a world, and is comparatively more similar to a proper karma system, largely being affected by whether you're out there killing hostile Black Phantoms or taking out non-hostile NPCs, either in the Nexus or out in levels. Again, there are background difficulty modifiers which are affected by this, but no unique events apart from the appearance of a new character, Mephistopheles. Although they did away with loading screens in the remake, back in the PS3 version there were images showing art of the game's various interactable characters, and I always remembered seeing the one for Mephistopheles and thinking, where the hell is this dude? Well, he'll only appear if you get a character tendency of pure black, which unfortunately means killing a few friends. Also, it's not even a dude, it's a woman. My bad. She'll give instructions to kill various characters within the Nexus, with the rewards being pretty damn decent for carrying out these assassinations. Of course, unless you truly are a cold-hearted monster, probably best to only start murdering all your friends and allies at the end of a playthrough, otherwise you'll flat out screw yourself out of being able to exchange boss souls for spells and miracles, and more. The only thing about Mephistopheles that I found kinda lame is that her dialogue doesn't really change regardless of who she's asking you to kill, whereas it could have been a nice opportunity to learn a wee bit more about some characters. Archstone 4 leads us to the Shrine of Storms, of which the opening level is Island's Edge, and it's decidedly less dark and disturbing than the Tower of Latria before it. The main enemies here are skeletons, and might I say, they're probably my favourite Soulsborne skeleton design. After Demon Souls, FromSoft would largely just stick to regular old bony skeletons, big and small, whereas the ones found throughout the Shrine of Storms have a uniquely metallic design, being coloured in silver, gold, or even black in order of difficulty. Mind you, for as much as I enjoy their unconventional design, the constant damaging rolls can make these things super hard to deal with, making them one of the most aggressive enemies in the game, though you can toss a soul remains to distract them for a bit. Although it's one of, if not the hardest opening level from any of the 5 worlds, there's a very good argument for coming to 4-1 straight after beating 1-1, and that's because of the Crescent Falchion +1 near the beginning, which starts out with a fantastic A rating in magic scaling, allowing you to blaze through much of Stonefang without even having to spend MP on spells. One of my favourite things about 4-1 is the Vanguard Demon at about the halfway point in the level, because there's no cutscene or fanfare here, there's just a big fucking demon in the middle of the map, though you can go right under him through the tunnels if having to deal with 2 silver skeletons in a tight tunnel doesn't bother you. It sure bothered me. Upon seeing this thing here again, I thought it was going to be a case of, okay, I got destroyed by it in the tutorial, but this is a bit later on in the game, let's do this, first time. In the end, I just came back here later and cheesed it with arrows, like a bitch. One of the most interesting and memorable elements of the Shrine of Storms in general is for sure the storm beasts constantly flying overhead. Of course, you can see them flying around at the start of the level, but they're out of range, and so you might even assume they're just part of the scenery, much like birds. But around the time you're fighting the Vanguard, spiked shards of magic crystal will periodically get sent your way by these things, meaning you always have to be listening out for that sound cue. Sometimes you'll seem to go about half a minute without getting fired upon, and then in other places they'll bombard you with projectiles, meaning you always need to keep moving, making some tough skeleton encounters that much tougher to deal with. I'm thinking this bit in particular. As annoying as these enemies are, I really like the way they start off visible but non-hostile, before becoming a constant threat and increasing the overall difficulty and tension of the level. And there's something oddly beautiful about their design too, though you can always just kill them if they really start pissing you off. One element where the Shrine of Storms really differs from the other levels is that there are no shortcuts here whatsoever, whereas the shortcuts found in most other levels are often fairly significant contributors to the enjoyability of their designs. I guess it's because the Shrine of Storms isn't quite as intricately laid out as other levels, so don't get me wrong, a shortcut or two would still have been welcome. The area boss of 4-1 is a bit of a weird one for me, because although I like the arena and I love the visual design of the boss, mechanically it's kinda shit. Most of the time the boss plays out like this. You enter the arena and see its tongue attack once or twice, You make it to the bottom and easily dodge the same one sword attack the Adjudicator will exclusively use for the remainder of the fight. You attack its obvious wound weak spot, then attack the bird to deal actual damage. The Adjudicator sorely needed an extra 2 or 3 attacks to make the fight at least somewhat challenging, because it looks incredible and might be the weirdest boss design in the game, but it's just not very interesting to fight, and nor is it very difficult to figure out how to damage it. I do like that you can just bypass hitting its wound weak spot altogether and directly attack the head with magic or a bow, though when I gave this a shot, the boss's AI just broke and the rest of the fight played out with it not even bothering to attack me. Quite a shame, but then again, I still do kinda like the fight. Maybe it's because of the wee bird, I like birds. Whereas 4-1 is largely spent outdoors dodging rolling skeletons and magic projectiles from the storm beasts, most of 4-2 is spent within the ancient interior of the shrine, though there are sections requiring you to traverse further into the shrine from along the top of the cliff face, guarded by more golden skeletons and storm beasts. The very beginning of the level has to be one of the most repeated sections of the game, partially because the level and its boss are pretty damn hard, but mostly because as far as I know, it's the best bit in the game for soul farming, as killing the Reaper enemy here also takes down all shadow lurkers in the area, giving you a nice heaping helping of souls each time. Plus, the Reapers are great for farming Moonshade Stone for upgrading Crescent weapons. Speaking of farming, 4-2 features the only way in the game to get a pure Bladestone for yourself, except it's a fucking nightmare and you probably shouldn't do it. This black skeleton here has a 0.5% chance of dropping a pure Bladestone, although that can be increased to 2.5% drop rate with a pure black world tendency. When it comes to farming items with a 10 or 20% drop rate, I'm down, just. But when you're dealing with drop rates in the single digits, yeah, fuck that. Because I always think, what if it just never drops? I mean, sure, you could get lucky and get one within the first 15 minutes. Or you could be farming for 8 hours without seeing one. Too much uncertainty. Similarly, it was possible to farm the Dark Wraiths from Dark Souls 1 for Titanite slabs, but again, disgustingly low drop rate. My favourite sections in Demon Souls are the rooms or areas which stand out from the rest of the level, world or game as a whole, like the Crystal Lizard room in 2-2 or the Twin Dragon area from 1-1, but my favourite section by far is the one featuring the phosphorescent slugs just before the boss room in 4-2. It just looks completely magical and unique, and you don't find this specific enemy anywhere else in the game. The way the light from the odd pale liquid is reflected off the walls down below is also a beautiful touch, as are the wandering white balls, there to tempt the curious player closer before exploding and completely fucking them up, sending them all the way back to the start of the level to once again fight through the Reapers, Shadow Lurkers and Skeletons. Do bear in mind that there's no shortcut in this level either. The boss of 4-2 is for sure one of the best in the game, and with a very interesting design, resembling no other human enemy in the game. The old hero is totally blind, and in fact, I think this is the only time FromSoft have ever implemented a boss mechanic where the enemy can't actually see you. It's hardly much of a secret strat nowadays after all these years, but the trick here is to put on the Thief's Ring, making it so the boss can barely detect you. Instead, just lashing out somewhat randomly throughout the fight and rarely connecting with its attacks. I do always kinda regret using this trick though, because it really does trivialise the fight. In fact, I only got hit a single time here, whereas I have fought the old hero before without the Thief's Ring, and it was way harder. Very good idea to use the hero demon's soul to create the large sword of searching though, which is the same weapon the boss uses, and just as awesome. And with 4-2 out of the way, that leaves us with the archdemon of the Shrine of Storms, one of the largest and most alien entities in the game, the Storm King. See, whereas the Dragon God was a gimmick boss done rather poorly, the Storm King is done spectacularly. As the early message on the ground tells the player, to challenge the Storm King, you need a weapon to rend the sky, and that weapon lies just ahead behind a large stone pillar. The boss itself will remain entirely out of reach at first, but after taking out enough of its storm beasts, either with the Storm Ruler or with a bow or magic, it will swoop down, allowing for a few long-range projectiles with the legendary sword. FromSoft would of course go on to implement the same gimmick in Elden Ring with the Serpent Hunter, as well as in Dark Souls 3, where they went as far as to call the weapon the exact same name, though the sword designs are completely different. Like nearly every Archdemon fight, this really isn't a difficult one, but it's for sure the most epic, and the rain and lightning weather effects added for the remake make the whole affair even more dramatic. Folks, that brings us to the fifth and final archstone leading to the home of the depraved and the unclean, the Valley of Defilement, which, I'm afraid, is my least favourite world. If you take Blighttown from Dark Souls 1, the Gutter from Dark Souls 2, and add in a generous splash of filth and disease, you get the Valley of Defilement, the original, crudely built over death pits and poison swamps. Forget your castles and prisons or mines and shrines, because all elements of elegance, human ingenuity or refinement are completely absent here, with its depraved inhabitants living in hopeless squalor and searching for new souls to gift to the archdemon of this underground valley. Now, I said that this is my least favourite world, and indeed it is, but that doesn't mean I think it's bad, because indeed I do not. I just don't really enjoy playing through it, which in a strange way is kind of the point of the level. It's by far the most treacherous of all the levels too, with many opportunities to fall to your death, and in fact, there's one enemy type situated at particular points throughout the level whose entire job it is to push you off to your death, which is so annoying. Being nailed by some enemy because you got sloppy and mistimed a roll or something is one thing, but being pushed off the ledge to your death by one of the otherwise weakest enemies in the game really hurts. I guess that's one of the interesting things about the Valley of Defilement, particularly in 1-1. The enemies really aren't very difficult, there's just quite a lot of them situated at awkward positions. The true enemy of this level is its layout, because with it being so dark and grimy and thrown together by the depraved ones who live here, it can be difficult to work out how to progress forward in some places. It's not just a case of there being 4 floors, like there is in the Prison of Hope. No, everything here is messy and at different elevations, accessible via ladders and dark pits. But mind and look to see what's lurking below before you leap. I wish I did. There are no new NPCs to rescue and send back to the Nexus in 4-1, giving the place an extra lonely feel, though there is a lady merchant, who's also Scottish, no less, selling some rather expensive grass, though I have always found her talk of a child to be quite disturbing. The idea of a child in this place is a pretty horrific thought, though the implication here seems to be that she's either lying about a child or completely out of her mind, like most Scottish people. The boss of 5-1 starts a trend of the world which will continue through to 5-2, and the archdemon of the world which waits directly after, and that trend is pathetically easy bosses. I guess the design is pretty cool, though strikingly similar to the first boss from Resident Evil 5 which came out the same year, but you can nail this thing in just a minute or two, especially if you use a black turpentine, or should I say black pine resin. Never quite understood why Bluepoint changed the names of some items, like making sticky white stuff into sticky white slime, or changing the red hot demon soul into the searing demon soul. I mean, the updated names aren't bad or anything, but can anyone explain to me why searing demon soul is a better name than red hot demon soul? Just leave it. Fix the fucking AI, but you can leave the names. I got hit by the boss's leech projectiles once or twice, but once I got close to the Leechmonger, it just didn't attack at all for about 25 seconds, and then when it did attack, it missed. Great job. So, for as much as I don't really enjoy 5-1, I enjoy 5-2 far less. While the entirety of the first level has us navigating our way over, under and through rotten wooden structures and bridges, 5-2 brings the player deeper into the base of the valley, and through the series' very first poison swamp. Not just any regular old poison swamp though, because as far as I can tell, it's composed entirely of liquid shit. As surprising as it may be to hear, these jellyfish looking enemies that float around in the mire are actually one of my favourite enemy designs in the game, because their disgusting appearance and movement fit the theme of this level so well. They're so fucking gross. Another enemy which is present in a far bigger way here compared to 5-1 are the large depraved ones. They can be really difficult to take down normally due to their high damage and how they don't stagger easily, but the limited mobility forced by the deeper parts of the swamp can make it so you can't even roll, though there are a few small islands you can attempt to fight on, including for the fight with the very first appearance of Maneater Mildred, though she hadn't yet been coined with that name back in Demon Souls. Something I wish I'd realised when actually playing through this level is that Bluepoint added a new ring into the remake, allowing increased mobility through the swamp, just like the rusted iron ring from Dark Souls 1. I was unaware of this until the time of writing though, and so I just played through the level like we used to do in the old days. Due to the frankly overpowered weapon I was using at this point in the game, I finally felt brave enough to take on a remote part of the level I'd always avoided in every previous playthrough, featuring 4 large depraved ones within the deep swamp with only a small island to use for dodging. It actually ended up being disappointingly easy to beat, but again, this was more thanks to my weapon than my skill as a player. And for anyone curious, the reward here is just 3 stones of ephemeral eyes. While I mentioned earlier that miracles in Demon Souls are mostly for healing and online play than for doing actual damage, that doesn't mean there are no fantastic weapons which scale with faith. And that brings us to the Moonlight Greatsword, or the Large Sword of Moonlight as it's called in this game, being completely enveloped in a slimy agglomeration of slugs until we cut it down. My first playthrough of the remake was when I first tried out the Moonlight Sword, and I was really surprised to discover that unlike in nearly all the other games, it's actually a pure faith weapon here with an S scaling in faith, though doing pure magic damage. The ideological tension between those who practice faith and those who practice the soul arts is a very interesting sub-theme in this game, because despite what the clergy seem to believe, miracles and magic both seem to draw their power from the same source. Hence why miracles started occurring again right around the time the demons began showing up, and why the soul arts are also at their most powerful in the presence of the demons. I also love how Sage Frake and his apprentices are situated over at one side of the Nexus, while Saint Urbane and his folk are at the other. It's a nice touch to show their mutual antagonism. At the end of the swamp, it's again time to traverse through a collection of chaotic hovels, and again it's pretty confusing to navigate your way through. There is a really handy shortcut once you reach here, allowing you to bypass the whole swamp if you happen to die, and indeed, I was on my way to activate it when this happened. Ugh, guess we're going through the swamp again. Thankfully though, you're quite unlikely to actually die against the level's boss, because that boss is the dirty Colossus, who is only slightly more difficult than the Leechmonger was, and frankly I'm glad, because by the time I get here, I just want the level to be over. They made this boss so much more disgusting in the remake, and I love that. After playing through the Valley of Defilement, I'm convinced that the good people over at Bluepoint have some sort of shit fetish. As easy as I'm saying this boss is, I actually got hit by it many times, except it just didn't matter, because its damage was terrible and it had next to no movement speed. Really not a bad boss, just very easy, and 5-2 really isn't a bad level. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it more while writing this retrospective, there's actually a lot about it that's really great. It's like FromSoft had a vision of the most disgusting, depressing and hopeless setting they could think of and then recreated it perfectly in the game, but the result was one I don't personally enjoy too much, and I pretty much always take on the Valley of Defilement last, whereas I look forward to places like Boletaria and the Shrine of Storms significantly more. The Archdemon of the Valley of Defilement has to be one of the game's most well-known bosses. I think a lot of people who've never even played Demon Souls, even before the remake, have heard about Maiden Astraea due to how unconventional a boss it is, as well as how surprisingly emotional it can be, not least of all due to one of the greatest themes of all time, which is why I was absolutely baffled as to why they changed that theme to the extent that they did for the remake. If the original didn't exist and someone came up with this track, I'd be down. I'd think, yeah, good theme. But compared to the genius of the original version, the remade track is infinitely more generic. They even dumbed down the rhythmic complexity of it, because Maiden Astraea's theme has some odd polymetric timings going on, which makes it even more musically impressive that the original composer managed to make it sound so beautiful too. It just bugs me that rather than just enhancing the original track with a bit of a remaster, they thought, no, I can do better than this. Well, no, you can't, fuck you. I'm joking, I just really love the original version of the theme. Back to the actual boss though, instead of it being a dragon, a fish, or a yellow turban, it's a woman. A saint who questioned the god she'd been following her whole life after seeing the misery of the inhabitants living in the Valley of Defilement, and so took it upon herself to become the archdemon of this land. As such, all the depraved ones we saw throughout the level are essentially the same soul-starved husks we see everywhere else, looking for more souls to bring to their saint. There are two ways to win this fight. You either run down into the bloody muck and straight up kill her, or you take out her champion, Geralt Vinland, in which case she'll just give up and end her own life, granting you her pure blood demon soul. Unfortunately, rather than the fight with Geralt Vinland being in any way challenging or dramatic, it's a bit of a joke due to his weapon often bouncing off the sides of the cave. As we've seen repeatedly, it's clear that boss difficulty wasn't a focus in this game. However, as we've also seen, sometimes that lack of difficulty seems more attributable to sloppy implementation or AI, rather than these fights playing out as you'd imagine the developers intended. I mean, was it FromSoft or Bluepoint's intention to have Garl Vinland's hammer bounce off the walls here? Why not place him elsewhere? A take I've seen a lot regarding this fight is that you're actually the bad guy here, coming in and ruining everything that Maiden Astraea has established in the valley, but I really don't feel this way at all. Yes, she seems very pleasant in her demeanour, and Garl Vinland also seems honourable in your brief exchange with him before the fight, but despite that, the Valley of Defilement remains a disgusting, miserable hellhole. This place isn't any sort of sanctuary, and it seems like everything is probably worse here than it was before. Thus, regardless of how noble her intentions might have been, I don't consider Maiden Astraea to be the good guy. Also, her new role as an archdemon only contributes to the wider devastation of the human race from the colourless fog and the demons. There's a very interesting and subtle touch regarding her pure blood demon soul though, because if you take it to Sage Frake, it can be exchanged for the Death Cloud spell, the description of which reads, Astraea, who willingly accepted the corrupted and corroded, naturally became the most corrupted of them all. Seems like a rather negative commentary on her character, especially with a spell called Death Cloud. However, if you take the soul to Uria, the witch, it can be exchanged for the relief spell, reading, Astraea is the most corrupted of all demon kind, but her essence parallels the most divine of beings. I love this because the duality here seems to represent the two main interpretations you can have on her character, whether you ultimately consider her actions to be good or bad, regardless of the fact that she's clearly not evil. And with Archstones 2 to 5 well and truly completed, that just leaves one final level and demon to be conquered, all the way back in Boletaria, where it all began. 1-4 really isn't a particularly long level, but it is a challenging one with some of the most dangerous enemies in the game, 3 of which are standing guard beyond the dead dragon in the courtyard. These black phantoms are actually supposed to represent the 3 previous bosses of Boletaria, with the great shield wielding knight of course supposed to represent the Tower Knight, and the guy with the penetrating sword obviously meant to represent the Phalanx. Not really though, it's presumably what the Penetrator would have looked like before transforming into a demon. The woman here is a bit confusing though, because while she shares no characteristics with the Phalanx other than a shield I guess, I believe this is what that big weird blob would have looked like before its demonic transformation. Although the red dragon was dealt with in spectacularly dull fashion back in 1-2, its blue counterpart appears properly here. I tried hitting this thing with arrows back in 1-1, but from what I can tell it can't be damaged at all there, with projectiles just phasing straight through it, sadly. You can kill the dragon in 1-4 in much the same way as the red dragon in 1-2, but again, it takes a damn while and it's not even necessary. You can still get past it, though killing the dragon does shift your tendency towards white by a decent amount, which can certainly be useful if you're having trouble achieving pure white. Again, sorry to bitch about the AI here, but why does the fat official just stand there and let himself be killed by the dragon? But never mind that, because this is nothing compared to the next part, where Bjorn will allow himself to be repeatedly bathed in flames by the blue dragon whilst doing absolutely nothing to avoid it. Nor will he even damage the dragon despite being armed with a crossbow, and he'll just do this until he dies. Though strangely, the flames do just 13 damage per hit. This part was nearly so cool, but the shitty AI kinda makes it into a joke. Inside the tower, Ostrava will again appear, having seemingly been roughed up by his father, Old King Allant, who waits further within. He'll give you a key before dying, and instantly come back as a Black Phantom for a final battle, where he's actually pretty tricky. The key you get happens to open the door guarded by that very first red-eyed knight back in 1-1, allowing access to the mausoleum, within which awaits Old King Doran, who interestingly is described in-game as a demigod, though no further explanation is provided regarding this. Also, I've always found it pretty weird that there's just this extravagant locked structure out in the open here, with some dude inside, just standing there. Makes you wonder how long he's actually been locked away here and why he isn't out there killing some demons. You don't need to come to the mausoleum at all, but there is a legendary weapon here called Demon Brand, though you need to fight Doran for nearly 2.5 minutes before you can claim it. Honestly, this fight is atrocious. He takes about 1/10 of the damage that other enemies do and barely even attacks. Of course, that's because this isn't really a proper fight. Whereas if you carry on attacking him after getting the sword, it becomes a proper fight, alright, and again, I hate it. He can just pop a grass and fully heal, is much more mobile, and can kill you in 1 or 2 hits. It's quite telling that most of the strats for actually beating Old King Doran involve cheese methods where you don't actually need to fight him, instead relying on damage over time or AI exploits. Returning back to 1-4, the way to Old King Doran is now clear, though not before a 50-second elevator ride up to his throne room. That is ridiculous, though it's not that much worse than the run back to Gwyn from Dark Souls 1, which I've also always thought was way too long. I've had a lot of people talk about Old King Allant being a really difficult fight, but that's never been an experience I've had with him. He's certainly one of the hardest bosses in the game, but that's not really saying all that much. By this point, you're likely to have amassed so many healing grasses that bosses like this just aren't all that much of a threat. The remake lowered the max number of any one grass you can carry to 25 compared to the 99 from the original, but that's still way more than enough, clearly. For the very last time, I will bring up yet another AI grievance, because again, it's not good here, which is a shame, because this boss could have been more than solid if Bluepoint had just bothered to fix it up a bit. Sometimes he'll just go into a loop where he will repeatedly do his big AoE attack 3 or 4 times in a row. It was exactly the same back on the PS3 version too, and all you can do when he does this is just run away and wait the 10 seconds for the attack to finish. There's no challenge to it, and it's completely pointless. In fact, I think this fight would have been significantly better if they'd removed this attack entirely, or even modified it to make it some sort of threat, because as it is, there were times where I was just standing there for a half a minute, unable to do anything while the boss spammed this attack, and to me that's just not my idea of a well implemented boss. That was not actually the real king though, instead being a demonic representation of him, but now that all the demons and archdemons throughout the land have been defeated, whose powerful souls we have inherited mind you, we are granted an audience with the source of the demonic scourge, the Old One.
Hear a voice of yore. The Old One calls for thee. Let us proceed below to its lair.
Bear in mind that the Old One is described as a bottomless pit of nothingness whose only purpose is to devour the souls collected by its archdemons, and now that they're all gone, it's interested in us. The relationship between the Maiden in black and the Old One is very mysterious, and she even talks to it like it's her pet at times here, and furthermore the Maiden in black is, or was, herself a demon. We find this out from the Soul Sucker spell which her soul can be exchanged for, and this is the same spell used by the Old King Allant demon, calling into question what relationship the Maiden in black may have had with the king or his demonic reflection. For all the whining about AI and boss themes I've done throughout this video, I really don't think this is a bad remake at all. I just think it could have been better in places, but this scene at the end with the Old One is a visual feast. The appearance of the Old One itself is also intriguing, because while it is the source of so much death and horror, its appearance is very nature-like, not only from the way it resembles a gargantuan tree, but there even seems to be an ecosystem of sorts within its mouth. making it seem like it itself isn't necessarily evil, but rather an infinitely powerful force of nature. The true form of King Allant is within the Old One as its current host, though he's been completely transformed into a blackened, pustule-covered mutant by now. King Allant's motive for beckoning the Old One back and taking refuge inside as it destroyed the world was that he looked upon the pain and suffering of the world and came to the conclusion that everyone would be better off dead or soulless, not entirely dissimilar to what Maiden Astraea thought, really, hence why she took the souls of the depraved in an effort to alleviate their suffering. The player has two choices at the end after killing the true King Allant. Either return back above, no longer a prisoner of the Nexus, who will be hailed as a legendary hero for defeating the demons and enabling the Maiden in Black to lull the Old One back to slumber, or become the Old One's new demonic host, working to engulf the rest of the world in the colourless fog before every last human soul has been devoured. Obviously, I chose the first option.
I shall lull the Old One back to slumber.
Actually, nah, fuck it.
The Old One senses a new and powerful demon by its side. And before long, the world will be engulfed by the deep fog. Bring more souls.
And that, folks, is Demon's Souls, the Souls Progenitor, the game that started it all, influencing every subsequent game in the series with its groundbreaking ideas, mechanics and motifs. Demon's Souls is nowhere close to being my favourite game in the Soulsborne series, and never has been, regardless of the modern makeover it received in the 2020 remake, but it's still a great fucking game. I don't love it, as I do Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Sekiro, but it has some incredibly high highs, while unfortunately also featuring some disappointing lows, which if anything were further highlighted in the remake. For as much as I could not get attuned to mechanics like world tendency, I absolutely appreciated its experimental nature, and FromSoft would go on to implement many more strange, hidden and experimental mechanics in its future games, and I think that's one of the many features of these games which make them so interesting. They're not conventional, and that all started with this game, with its unique bosses and approach to both game and story design. And on that note, I shall end the video. As always, cheers for watching and cheerio.